started with Sherlock Holmes. He's one of those people without whom forensic science would not exist.
Holmes was so far ahead of his time. That's what's so cool about him, is that he is the first to use these same techniques that we use 120 years later.
Sherlock Holmes, I consider him as the grandfather of forensic science. When I go to crime scene, I use his logic, solving cases.
Sherlock Holmes was the first one to give law enforcement the idea that they should look at something with a magnifying glass to look for the things that you couldn't see.
Which is still one of my favorite tools today. It's my magnifying glass. I go nowhere without it.
I wonder what Holmes would think about the state-of-the-art, the cutting-edge technology that we have today. In my view of Holmes, he'd probably say, "What took you so long?"
Sherlock Holmes, the greatest ever fictional detective, worshipped by police the world over as the man who taught them how to solve crimes. Sherlock Holmes was the first to protect crime scenes from contamination, the first detective to look for minute evidence and traces, to search for what the eye couldn't see, to sniff, to measure, to make astonishing deductions.
The murderer was a man. He had small feet for his height. He wore coarse, square-toed boots and smoked a Trichinopoly cigar.
From blood to ballistics, to fingerprints, footprints, and poison, Sherlock Holmes was 120 years ahead of his time.
Without the inspiration of Sherlock Holmes, I wouldn't have become a forensic scientist, and I wouldn't have solved the cases that I've solved.
Sherlock transformed the world of crime investigations, and over a century later, this fictional detective is still helping to solve crimes.
This murder was very much a case that could be a perfect Sherlock Holmes adventure. It got me really to understand how Sherlock Holmes was so much like modern-day forensic scientists.
Because there's careful observation based on Sherlock Holmes' logic, we was able to solve the case.
When Sherlock first burst onto the scene in Victorian England, the police certainly needed his help. London, the last day of August 1888. The day one of history's most notorious serial killers claimed their first victim.
He did 6 murders within a mile in less than 90 days.
As the terrible killings continued, the ineptitude of the police's then standard investigative methods became clear. Little or no evidence was collected from the crime scenes, which were quickly contaminated by police and onlookers.
Back then, there was no crime scene contamination. A crime scene was just a crime scene, and whoever needed to be inside of it went.
There was no picking over the scene. They weren't doing anything like Sherlock. The focus was still trying to find an eyewitness.
Evidence? What do you mean, evidence? They would leave mountains of it around, not recognizing what it was.
Arthur Conan Doyle was still a young eye doctor when he published the first Sherlock story, just a few months before the Ripper murders began. Sherlock's cutting-edge evidence gathering was in stark contrast to what the police were doing.
That was the focus of the Sherlock Holmes stories, this evidence that otherwise, in most criminal cases, was not being gathered. All these things were foreign concepts to police at the time. They were not there to be thinkers. They were not there to be evidence gatherers or interpreters. Forensic science did not even exist. Criminal investigation consisted essentially of rounding up the usual suspects and getting confessions from them, to be quite blunt. We're talking brawn, not brains.
Sherlock was about to change the world forever, first in fiction, then in fact. But it was too late to catch Jack the Ripper, leaving the most iconic crime of the last 200 years unsolved. But from the very first Sherlock adventure, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was unwittingly writing the world's first forensic science manual.
A Study in Scarlet was the first book that I read when I started crime scene investigations. And I thought, this is really relevant 120 years later.
A Study in Scarlet gave birth to the great detective. He was arrogant.
My dear Lestrade, I've investigated many crimes, and I have yet to see one which has been committed by a flying creature.
Eccentric. Clever.
So long as the criminal remains upon two legs, so there must be some indentation, some abrasion, some trifling displacement, which may be found by the scientific researcher.
And a pioneering chemist.
If this paper remains blue, all is well. If not, it means a man's life.
Catching the spirit of the age, of scientific inquiry and discovery, the public couldn't get enough of Sherlock Holmes' adventures, and the stories rapidly became bestsellers.
Conan Doyle's mission is to educate people to say, hey, look, this is how scientific investigations ought to be done. Sherlock Holmes was a mechanism for delivering this idea that physical evidence was important. It's almost like reading a manual for investigation. That search for competence, for integrity, for thoroughness, that's the story that Conan Doyle wants to tell, because that's what he wants people to emulate.